This, again, is part of the Billionaire's Playbook for a Financial Breakthrough Year series. And this is where I've been talking about Ray Dalio's Holy Grail of investing. The core principle that a lot of sophisticated investors use, that I use to really accelerate my financial freedom journey, to boost my passive income by 50%. And I use the same principles to triple our assets under management last year. But apart from the core principle, we also talked about the 7-step process, right? So there is the imbibing of the principle, but it's also a process that really helps you to implement the principle and take massive action. And it's what I've been doing for the last few years. And given that it is the beginning of the year, I think it's a great time for all of us to listen to this process. This is something that my coaches teach me constantly, and we work on this in the beginning of the year. So we're talking about the core principle, we're talking about the process. We also talked about levers that you can use to gain momentum. We talked about tax strategies and how things are actually shifting this year and in the near future. That was the last episode of the series. But with this episode and the following one, I wanted to show case studies of physicians, right, with their actual numbers, with the struggles that they face, so that you can see how they've used this core principle and the process, the 7-step process, to really grow their income and to be able to, in some cases, shelter their clinical income from taxes. And today we're going to be talking about one of my close friends who lives locally, who's a pediatrician and is also a millionaire real estate investor. And she self-manages her portfolio of long-term rentals and also invests in syndications, right? So she's more on the passive side. And, next time we'll talk about a physician couple who have really gone more active with short-term rentals and tax strategies to shelter clinical income from taxes. But today we're going to talk about the more passive approach, right? And how even with that, she has been able to double her passive income in a few years, right, since she started investing. And when I listen to a lot of physicians, the barriers to investing in real estate are often the same, right? I don't have enough time. I don't think I have the money. And, I hear a lot of physicians say it's a struggle because it almost feels like they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they don't know where to get started. And as I want you to build your massive action plan for this year, I wanted to share stories of physicians who've used the same process and the results they have, so that can inspire you to do the same. And today we'll be talking about her journey to doubling her passive income in a few short years, what she wished she'd done sooner, and mistakes that she made along the way, so we can learn from other people's mistakes without making the same mistakes.
Welcome to Generational Wealth MD's podcast on financial freedom through investing in real estate. My name is Param Baladandapani. I'm a mom, radiologist, real estate investor, and mentor to others looking to start or scale their real estate portfolios. The goal of this podcast is to provide you with inspiration, strategies, and insight so that you can stop trading your time for money and live life on your terms. If you love the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Let's get started. So I wanted to start first with her journey, right? So I would say a few years ago, pre-pandemic, she was primarily investing in the stock market, right? And so she had retirement accounts, a brokerage account for where she was investing outside of her retirement accounts. And she also had a whole life policy that she was paying into annually. And there are different opinions about whole life policies. For most physicians, in my opinion, a laddered term life is often the best product. And so there's a little education that needs to be had around that, or at least be aware of what your options are. But that's essentially what she was doing. And real estate was really not on her radar. And I would say it wasn't because she didn't know how to do it, although that's what we think most of the time before we start. Like, it just feels like, okay, why wouldn't I just continue to do what I'm doing? I think a big part of that is because most physicians don't realize why they should be doing it, right? And so since after we started having discussions, that's when I had my moment. That's when I started pivoting, right? When I started leaning into the holy grail of investing, which is the concept of having non-correlated assets, other alternative asset classes that are not correlated to the stock market within your portfolio, which then significantly lowers risk. But it also increases your returns, because not only are you getting cash flow from these cash flowing properties when you buy them right, you're also building equity over time, right? Especially when you use leverage, you're building significant equity. And one of her goals, and that was something that I didn't realize for the first 7 years that I was investing in real estate, I didn't really see how much equity I was building over time till 2020. I deep dived and I was like, okay, my God, this is so much, it's more impactful than I ever thought it would be. So I was able to walk her through the process. And for her, a big goal was, okay, the equity in these properties could potentially, and you can tap into the equity in your real estate portfolio tax free, right? You can do a cash out refinance, tap into it. And I know of a lot of people who are doing that to pay for a child's college education, right? And so that excited her. She said, okay, the returns are high. For her, more importantly, was I really want to start investing in non-correlated assets. And so she wanted diversification and lowering of risk. That was important to her. So for that reason, once she understood that whole concept, which is again the holy grail of investing, right? You're lowering risk and getting the same or better returns once you start diversifying out into these non-correlated assets. She said, let's do this, right? And once we built out that plan for her, again, it was the 7-step process, right? So you always start off with the results, right? Why, what is the result that I'm looking for? For her, it was getting a more resilient portfolio, really getting to financial freedom and having the ability to have the funds to pay for college without thinking about it, right? To get those financial breakthroughs, to have those breakthroughs. And she knew what her purpose was, and we built out an action plan. Now, the action plan needs to be personalized. I talk about this a lot, which is why I'm showing you examples of how people do it so differently, right? Next, in the next episode of this series, we're going to talk about Valerie and Zach, who decided to go the short-term rental route. And they're able to shelter Valerie's clinical income from taxes because they did it. And within a 3-month period, they went from really starting from scratch to owning a short-term rental where they have raving reviews, right? And this friend, who's a pediatrician, she wanted it to be more passive, right? And we'll talk about her numbers. We'll talk about how much she had to put in, how much time she spends on a portfolio, but she wanted it to be simple. And so when you get to your massive action plan, it is going to be personalized. And that's a key point. And if you are looking to understand the different strategies and really build out your personalized action plan, then if you haven't signed up for the 10X event, make sure you do that. That's generationalwealthmd.com/event in lowercase. It's happening the first week of March. It's for anyone who's looking to start. It's for anyone who has a few properties, but you feel like you aren't cash flowing or you aren't tapping into those tax strategies. You're not getting significant cash flow and you want to start scaling. For all of you, we have multiple speakers, people who are starting, people who are getting creative with financing, speakers who have multiple short-term rentals that they're managing, self-managing, and they're out of state and they're sheltering clinical income from taxes, replacing their clinical income from taxes. So all different, speakers, physician speakers at different levels. So definitely sign up. That's where we really deep dive into how do you build your action plan. But then the next part of the 7-step process is going to be prioritization, time stamping. And she always knew, like, when this is my goal for the year and this is what I'm going to do. These are my next steps. I'm going to get it done within this time frame. And you're using leverage, which is the next step of the 7-step process. We'll talk about how she used leverage, but a big part of it is going to be that last step, which is execution and course correction, which is where community comes into play. That's where accountability partners, coaches come into play. And again, that's something, if you're looking for that, join the 10X event. We're going to have a lot of that. You're going to interact a lot with the community and really start having other people hold you accountable. So definitely sign up. But for her in her journey, a lot of that was, especially if you look at the last 4 years, there was a low interest rate environment where a lot of properties made sense and then interest rates shifted. And I always say this, your criteria doesn't really shift, but your terms will have to shift, right? So your terms for what you're looking to acquire will start shifting. And often it's nice to have someone to bounce that by. And so to really help you see why you need to start shifting your terms so you can actually acquire, because acquisition models shift in different parts of the market cycle, right? And so at one point she shifted to the syndication model because that's what she had to do to deploy her capital. And it's also about, why it's important to take steps in a timely manner, why it's important to diversify, not just across geography, but also across, temporally, across time, right? And that's the concept of dollar cost averaging, making sure you're getting in at different parts of the market cycle, which also goes back to the holy grail of investing, which is diversification, right? Diversification across asset classes, geography, across time. And oftentimes in the journey, you need accountability partners to really help you course correct and execute, right, when things are different from what they used to be. Okay, so that's the 7-step process. That's the core principle. That's what she tapped into. So let's look at what she was able to do. Again, she decided to go down the passive route. She started acquiring long-term rentals locally, and her plan was to self-manage. Now, for a lot of physicians, including me, it may be just handing off long-term rentals to a property manager. When you have short-term rentals, it may make absolute sense for you to go ahead and self-manage because you can tap into tax savings, and property management fees are higher for short-term rentals. For a lot of physicians, for long-term rentals, it makes sense to use a property manager, but she chose to self-manage, right? Again, that's all about personalizing your journey. And then when it comes down to money, right, the next question is, where do I find the money to start investing in real estate? Because there is this idea that it takes a lot to be able to do that. Now, in her case, she acquired properties that were between $250,000 to $300,000, right? And she was able to start off by doing 25% down. Now, you don't always have to do that. There are ways to invest in real estate where you can put 10% down, where you can house hack, where you have creative financing strategies, where you're able to do rehabs, increase your equity, tap into that same bucket of money over and over again, recycle it to grow your portfolio, use your tax returns, which, when you invest in real estate and you use the short-term rental strategy or real estate professional status, you're able to tap into tax strategies, get a tax refund. You can reuse the same bucket of money over and over again to scale. And if you are hearing these things for the first time, make sure you join the 10X event. We will deep dive into these core concepts. But there are different ways to get creative about financing. And so it's doable for people who, even for people who think for those of you who think you feel like you don't have enough money to get started, there are many ways to do it. She went down the traditional 25% down conventional mortgage route. In terms of the amount of time that she spends on her portfolio, although she chose to self-manage her properties, which means she finds the tenants. If there is an issue, then she's responsible for communicating with the handyman to resolve it, or the plumber. Despite that, on average, with 4 long-term rentals at this time, she spends on average about an hour a month managing her properties, right? And so oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh, I don't want to deal with tenants, toilets, termites, and trash, I believe it is, right? So, but the honest truth is, if you're doing things right, then it's really not as time intensive as most people make it out to be, right? And then you still have options. You can choose to offload all of that to a property manager, but even self-managing, she's spending an hour a month on her portfolio on average. Now, again, she chose to remain passive. So there was a point in time where, and you guys probably remember this, it was a seller's market. It was really hard to land a property because there were multiple offers. At that point, she wanted to deploy her capital. Again, she had her massive action plan and she had timestamps, so she needed to deploy, and she chose to invest in a syndication with us at GW Capital in Atlanta. And so the goal behind that was, again, deploying her capital, but also diversification, right? And it goes back to that holy grail of investing, diversification, geographically, but also continuing to deploy capital without sitting on the sidelines, right? And finding a strategy that worked, where again, with syndications now, as general partners, we go in and do the value add strategy. So you are getting significantly higher cash flow than you would potentially in some market cycles by buying your own property, right? When interest rates are high and property prices are really high and you're getting into a bidding war, at that point, that strategy made sense, right? So she was able to pivot because she had a plan and she knew how to take action, and she was course correcting, right?
If you're interested in learning how to invest in long-term and short-term rentals the right way, so you can accelerate to financial independence with the support of mentorship, community, and vetted investor agents in strong markets across the country, then get on the waitlist for the next cohort of Creating Generational Freedom at www.generationalwealthmd.com. You don't have to learn from decades of costly mistakes by yourself. The program is only open for enrollment in the spring and fall each year. In the last 6 months alone, our members have acquired over $60 million of real estate, and more importantly, they're living life and practicing medicine on their terms. You don't have to do it alone.
And so for those of you who are considering being passive and want to invest in syndications passively as limited partners, we will be going over syndication due diligence during the 10X event. So make sure you show up. That's generationalwealthmd.com/event in lowercase. But so she, again, then went on to acquire one property a year, right? It doesn't have to be crazy. You can tailor it however you want to do it. We have physicians who are acquiring 30 units, like 30 unit multifamily properties in a year and two short-term rentals, and there are those who are just doing one a year. But I wanted to show you how much of an impact even that can have, right, over time. And so at this point, right, with her beginning to acquire over the last 3 years, last 4 years now, at this time, her cash flow, which is what hits your bank account after all expenses, right? So her cash flow from the four properties is about 2,500 a month, right? That's her cash flow. Now, that is going to be tax free because of depreciation, right? And that's something that she gets to keep tax free. What I want you to note over here is that over time, even if she doesn't acquire anything beyond this, the cash flow from these properties will increase. And that's because real estate rents and prices are inflation adjusted, right? So the first property that she acquired 4 years ago, she acquired it at which point the rent was about $1,800, right? Today, they are getting close to $2,500 in rent. So the rents have gone up significantly, right? But their debt, their mortgage payment, which is their largest expense, stays steady, which means over time their cash flow increases, right? So that's what you need to understand and for me, it took me 7 years of sitting on a small portfolio to actually see that happen, to have my light bulb moment. So I want to share this with you so you are getting those breakthroughs much faster and you're starting, way ahead of where I started. But so that's what happens, right? The cash flow is incrementally getting larger and larger. Now remember, a lot of these properties were acquired in a high interest rate environment. So that is still a significant number for a small 4 property portfolio where she's just buying and holding. She's not doing anything fancy with rehabs or short-term rentals or midterm rentals, right? But what is more powerful, and this is where I think the breakthrough happens for most people, is that don't just look at the cash flow. Right now she has about $30,000 tax-free coming in, that goes and hits her bank account every month. And so that to get that income, that is almost 75% of her income in medicine, right? That she's getting just from this very, very passive strategy of acquiring one long-term rental a year. So she's, she's getting close to what she would have to like almost double her salary to make. But the more important thing is that her equity in these properties over the last 4 years has increased by $300,000. And what does that mean? That means that, if she purchased the property for $250,000 and today it's worth $350,000, her debt, right? Her debt stays the same. Her debt isn't changing. And that additional 100,000 is her equity, which is money that she can tap into at any point by doing a cash out refinance. She can tap into it tax-free, and she could use that for anything, right? She could use that for a child who's going to college. And so over time, this starts really growing and compounding. And that's happening because of market appreciation that's happening over time. A part of that is also because of debt pay down, right? That's when she is taking the rent and paying down the mortgage, and a portion of that goes towards her principal, which is the equity she's building in the property, right? So she has and that's a very conservative number, but over $300,000 of equity that's built up over time. Okay. So that's what her portfolio looks like. That was her strategy. That was her leaning into the holy grail of investing and the 7-step process. And so I asked her, in the interest of benefiting everyone else who's listening to this, what she would have done sooner. Right. So a big question is always, in hindsight, what would you have changed? And I think for most people who have done this, now, if she never took the leap and she never experienced the magic of that first deal, she would never be here looking back and saying, oh, I could have done this, right? So for those of you looking to start, remember the first property is the biggest leap of faith that you will take, but it's also the thing that's going to set you free, right? And so from this vantage point, she's looking back, and what she said was she would have started investing in real estate sooner. And she also would have started investing in her 401k sooner, because I think during her residency, she really didn't contribute to her 401k or a Roth, which she would have been eligible for at that point, because there really wasn't any awareness, right? So same thing. So start your journey, start before you're ready. You It's probably never going to feel like you're ready, so you will have to start before you're ready. That's a key point that keeps coming up all the time. Same thing for her 529 plan. She wished she'd started sooner. And I think the other thing was comfort level with debt, which again, it doesn't apply to everyone, but there are a lot of people, especially physicians, because we tend to be very conservative. And especially if you're an immigrant physician, because, where we come from in India, a lot of real estate is acquired without debt, just because lending terms are very, very different over there. But getting comfortable with debt really allows you to start investing and scaling. And so those were her regrets in terms of what she would have done sooner if she had the insight. Okay. And then in terms of, so I went back and okay, so what were the biggest mistakes that you made? And I was like, I really want people to get these core concepts and avoid making the same mistakes. One of the things that I think I highlight more than she does is getting a 15-year loan for her primary residence or investment properties, right? And I see quite a few people do that. And I would say, especially for investment properties, most investors, and there's actually a chart that, we teach within our coaching program, Creating Generational Freedom, where you can actually look to see the numbers. And when you look at it in the beginning, it seems like, okay, I'm paying so much more interest with a 30-year loan product, so let me go with a 15-year loan product. But what actually happens is that with a 30-year loan product, as an investor, you're looking at cash flow, right? You're not paying down that interest that is coming from your rent. Your interest is a deductible expense for you, right? And so what you're looking at as an investor is cash flow. You don't want to be pouring your money into that property. You don't want it to be burning a hole in your pocket. It should be putting money in your pocket. So for most investors, it makes sense to do a 30-year loan. And because that cash flow gets reinvested, if you actually look at it, it takes 22 years for you to get to the point where you're actually, the amount of interest that you're paying in terms of, whatever you're putting towards your 15-year loan versus your 30-year loan, there's a breaking point at which point you're actually putting more money into a 30-year loan, right? So that's it's usually about the 22-year mark, and all of the cash flow you have during those first 22 years, if you're reinvesting it, and that is doubling over 5 years, which typically happens in real estate at the very least, then you come out far ahead with a 30-year loan product. Okay, so just think about it from that perspective. With a 30-year loan product, it seems like you're paying more in interest, but that is a deductible expense, and you get higher cash flow. Your cash flow is reinvested, and so you're able to hold on to the property, but you're also reinvesting, and it helps you grow much faster. At the end of the day, if you're reinvesting the cash flow you get from the property, you're coming out way ahead with a 30-year loan product. So that was one of the mistakes that, again, she needed to correct over time. Another one was considering or really rapidly paying down her primary home loan that she had a 2.5% interest rate on. Now, you've heard me say this many times before. For those of you who have home loans with interest rates under 3%, that lending product itself is super valuable, for decades to come. We're probably never going to go back to that interest rate. And so if you have something like that, you will never get a lending product that sweet. You really want to leverage that and use your capital elsewhere to grow, and just always think about the arbitrage, right? And so that was one of the mistakes that she identified, wanting to pay down a primary home loan that was at 2.5% interest rate. So, and then her whole life policy, again, is something that she ended, and there was a little bit of a penalty. She realized for her plan, and I always say, build out your own investment policy statement, build out your own personalized roadmap. For her, it made sense to invest in real estate as opposed to keep that going in terms of taking her savings and investing it where she was getting higher returns. Now you need to build out your personalized plan and think about asset allocation for you. And so, if you have questions, drop them here, or we'll see you at the event and we'll plan that out for you. But those were the mistakes that she talked about. So we talked about her journey. We talked about how impactful that's been. And I'm saying not just the $30,000 of tax-free income that she's getting every year, which is the equivalent almost, especially in California, of earning an additional $60,000 of clinical income. But it's the $300,000 of equity that she's built up over time, which is super powerful if you ask me. We talked about what she wished she'd done sooner and the mistakes that in hindsight she could have avoided. Now, the the next episode of this series is going to be about Valerie and Zach, who went from, and they were in the fall cohort of creating generational freedom. So October, they started looking for their short-term rental. They acquired it, and by the end of the year, they had hit material participation. They got raving reviews, and they are on track to get significant tax sheltering of Valerie's clinical income when they file taxes this year. So that's a very interesting story, very different story, but very interesting story. We'll talk about how they leaned into the holy grail of investing, how they use the 7-step process. Super excited about that. And I will see you then. But in the meantime, if you haven't signed up for the 3-day event, make sure you do, because we're going to lean into these core concepts in depth, and we'll help you build out your plan, course correct, reevaluate things, and come up with an action plan, and that prioritization, time stamping, and really leaning into leverage. All of those are going to be key. Sign up at generationalwealthmd.com/event in lowercase. I think it's really interesting to see other people's journeys and listen to their numbers, because for me, in my head, it helps me really solidify the core concepts, but also figure out what makes sense for me. And so, yeah, give me your feedback. I'd love to know what you think about it. All right, take care, guys.